Coming up next, the All Things Jewish Show with my special guests, Holocaust survivors Mr. Max Michelson and Mr. Izzy Milkel. Stay tuned.
Lie, 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 lie,
Hi, I'm Ed Brookmeyer, and welcome to the new edition of All Things Jewish. May is an important month on the Jewish calendar. On May 14th, 2016, the State of Israel was 68 years old. 3 days earlier, we celebrated Yom HaZikaron, which is the Israeli Memorial Day, recognizing the 23,000 people who lost their lives to preserve Israel's independence. Earlier in the month, on May 4th, we recognized the survivors of the Holocaust by observing Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. So it is only fitting that today we speak with two local members of our community to hear about their Holocaust experiences. They are similar in that they are both survivors, but they have two very different stories to relate. Join us now for a discussion with Max Michelson and Izzy Milkel. Max, this is the first time you and I have met, and you have met Izzy as well, yet I feel like the three of us in the few minutes before the show started really started to connect here. We know that we have very different stories here to relate, and I'd like to start in a general conversational way so that it's not really an interview, but that questions that Izzy may have or I may have about what you're going to start to relate to us, we can all jump in and ask. So with that said, I'd love to start and hear a little bit about your experiences.
I was born and raised in Riga, Latvia. And while there was anti-Semitism, it was for Jews a relatively good place to live. And we lived there. Latvia was part of the Tsarist Russia before World War I, and became an independent country, one of a number of independent countries around, keeping the Soviet, the Bolshevik infection out of Europe. So Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland were all started at that time. And between the two world wars, we lived in Latvia. My parents and family had lived in Latvia for a long time, at least 200 years previously. But now, between the wars, it seemed like a nice place to live. Not perfect, but really there were no pogroms in Latvia. And when the war started, we lived under the delusion, and it really was a delusion, that Latvia would be left alone between Stalin and Hitler.
Your family background, were you have an only child, or did you have brothers and sisters?
I had an older sister who died in 1934 of meningitis. So at the time in 1939 or 41, actually the war started for us when Hitler attacked the Soviet Union in June 22nd, Sunday, June 22nd, 1941. I remember it today.
You got that date down.
Oh yeah, that's burnt in. And it was clear to us at the time. Now, let me talk a little about the family. My father had a plywood factory. Actually, the family had a plywood factory in Riga. that had been founded by my grandfather. My grandfather died in 1907, I believe, very young. And my father took it over as the managing director. My uncle was an engineer, the chief engineer in the factory, and we lived right next to the factory. In the 1930s, when we were a well-to-do family, there was cash flow was a problem, and most of the wealth was really tied up in the factory and in some houses and so on, some real estate. And the question on almost a couple of days later, after the Sunday, I remember we sat around the living room. My uncle was a bachelor, he wasn't married. So my mother, father, and my uncle, myself, sat around the living room deciding whether we want to run to the Soviet Union or whether we want to stay under the oncoming German occupation. Neither of us was an attractive alternative. Stalin had already murdered my mother's youngest brother, who had lived in, was a chemical engineer in Leningrad, on the pretext that he was a German agent. And that was under Stalin's purges in 1938. So and we were bourgeois, and the fact is my father would not have survived anyway under the Soviets either. My mother probably would have, but my father not. My father was around 61. My mother was about 10, 11 years younger. She was 50 or 51.
How old were you at the time?
I was 16. So, and I really considered myself part of the family, so that leaving alone for me was not an option that I considered. I had friends who went with their older brothers or older siblings, who went to the Soviet Union and managed to survive there. I probably would have survived. I would have ended up in the Red Army sooner or later anyway. But the fact is, we knew life under Germany would be very difficult. We knew of the ghettos in Poland. We didn't quite appreciate all the killings that occurred, but we knew it would be very difficult. What was inconceivable for us was the German state would murder all Jews, period. That was, outside civilized behavior. Germany, after all, was the civilized country in Europe. It had a long history of literature, that we were really well familiar with German culture, with German history and so on. So we decided not to run. Part of the reason of not going was also that the Soviet Union did not encourage people from the Baltics to escape to the Soviet Union. We were really not considered as trustworthy Soviet citizens. And to some extent they were right. I mean, we're clearly anti-communist. We're left-wing social democrats was the general political outlook in the family. But we were not Bolshevik communists.
So at that time, Germany looked like a very good alternative.
No.
No.
It looked like an acceptable alternative.
An acceptable one.
It looked like we knew we would end up in the ghetto. But we also thought the Warsaw Ghetto by that time was practically 2 years old. Lodz Ghetto was about the same, and people lived. You can barely call it living, but they were not killed at that time. So we thought that we might survive better there than Stalin killed people too. The only difference was, and that was an important difference, they didn't kill Jews because they were Jews. They killed Jews because they were bourgeois.
Political reasons.
So we stayed in Riga. Riga fell on July 1st, 10 days. There was sort of an interregnum where the Red Army was running away, and we stayed in Riga. And the German troops came in on July 1st, and overnight we were no longer human.
What was the first thing that they began to do?
Catch Jews on the street And what we saw at the time was all the persecution was done by Latvian collaborators, and there were quite a few. The general Latvian population were bystanders. They did not object, and they did not. They did not try to help. Let's say they have to qualify that. Helping Jews was an extremely dangerous proposition. In Eastern Europe, and in Latvia in particular, if they caught Jews hiding with Latvians or with any non-Jews, they killed the Jews and they killed the non-Jews on the spot. In Western Europe, they sort of had some nice gloves on. When they caught people in Holland, they shipped them to Auschwitz or etc. When they called people hiding Jews in Latvia, they killed them on the spot. So there was no pretense in Germany, in France. There was some kind of pretense of civilized behavior. Pretense is the right word, but in Latvia there was none. And there were now coming, the people who really participated in it there was a former we had, I should back up a minute, for 1 year, 1940, June 40 to June 41, we were under Soviet occupation. We became a Soviet state. And under the Soviets, the NKVD did a lot of murders. Not Jews in particular, but some Jewish bourgeois. We were sent out. There was a evacuation overnight. You know, and that happened 2 weeks before the war started. Knock, knock, in the middle of the night, 2 o'clock in the morning. You have half hour to pack things and we'll ship you out. You know, for Latvia, this was unheard of.
Right.
And it was another matter of why we decided not to run to the Soviet Union.
To put it into some sort of perspective, because I forget my history a little bit, had the Germans, the Nazis, already occupied Poland at that point in time?
The war started in Poland in September 1949. 1939, September 1939, this war with the attack on Poland. And within a rather short time, Germany had occupied half of Poland. Half of Poland they gave at that time to the Soviet Union. And Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania were given to the Soviet Union. Germany said to them, never mind. But a year later, by June of 40, the Soviets made an ultimatum. We're coming in, we took over. A relatively peaceful takeover. The Jewish working class welcomed the Soviets. And the Latvians never forgave them for that. Not only didn't they forgive them, they created the myth that the NKVD in Latvia were all Jews, and they killed all Latvians. That was a myth. There were a lot of Latvian communists, Bolsheviks really, who were part of the NKVD, did very well, thank you, killing other Latvians. But now when the Germans came in, there was a former pre-Soviet police, the pre-Soviet army. There was a home guard called Aizsargi, Latvian protectors, who were also pre-Soviets, and some very vicious anti-Semitic fraternities.
And these pre-Soviet groups were still existing there.
Groups, and most of them had survived or hidden or so, and now they came out from under the Iraqs and attacked Jews. In fact, they didn't attack, they killed Jews. Almost immediately, Jews were dragged from apartments, found on dragged on the streets. There was a typical humiliation, cleaning streets or toilets with toothbrushes, that kind of thing, cutting beards, and a number of them were immediately taken to the woods and killed.
You must have been frightened living in those kind of conditions.
Yes.
That's terrifying.
Yes.
For a 16-year-old.
Well, for anyone.
Especially a 16-year-old.
I don't know. At the time, I think I did not quite appreciate the horror of it. I had well, we had been kicked under the Soviets and nationalized our factory, by the way. I should go back a little bit. Part of the reason we did not escape when escape was possible was that the factory was part of the family. And what we had to do, had to do, was leave everything, take very few things, and some smuggled money and out. And my parents obviously were not prepared to do that. My uncle, who lived in Paris, and he was an artist living in Paris, came in 1938, a year before the war, and said, "Get out."
He saw what was going on in other places and tried to sort of warn the family about it.
Yes, yeah, he had a better sense.
But I can certainly understand you had deep roots there. Your family had a business that went back generations, and to leave that is leaving a part of yourself.
We couldn't take money out, and for that matter, most of the wealth was in the house, in the factory, and wherever. At the time, on the other hand, one other thing, the Germans came in and sat behind the scenes and essentially said, the Jews it's open season on the Jews, you can go and kill. And the Latvian collaborators participated very enthusiastically. You know, we had a Latvian fascist government from 1934 to 1939 under Karlis Ulmanis. But Karlis Ulmanis, well, it was a fascist government, and it was anti-Semitic in many ways, but not in killings. And he kept a lid on the whole thing, like he kept a lid on the Latvian Nazi party, the Thundercross, Birkenkreuz. They were kept under illegal, under the fascist government. So, now when the Germans came in, they all came out. They were no longer illegal, and in a sense they were permitted to kill Jews, and they did it. We saw all the killings by the locals. On the other hand, I know now from documents and so, the Germans sat behind, hidden, and encouraged it. In fact, the German SS commander Stahlecker, who was at the time the German SS commander in Latvia, complained to Berlin that the popular uprising and killing of Jews was not enough. They didn't react. He complained. As far as we are concerned, it was terrible. So, personally, I had the bike. I had the summer job, and when the Nazis came in, I naively took my bike, went to the factory where we started to work before, and said, no Germans, I'm going to have a summer job. No, not so. I was told that they'll need me, so don't come back. Nonetheless, I did not sit home. Every morning, 8 o'clock, out with my bike on the street. That's how I survived. I come back, we were not known in the neighborhood where we lived. So
was your neighborhood a mixed neighborhood of Jews and non-Jews?
Yes, it was all mixed.